as he saw the beast's throat approaching ever closer. Indeed, he was not wrong. Right up until the end, he didn't live an embarrassing life. Just before the beast's maw swallowed his head, Lennart quietly closed his eyes, thinking that there would be no more need to open them again. But then, a sudden noise of explosion coming from his front shocked Lennart, and he quickly opened his eyes. After confirming that the shadow soldier attached to Thomas Andre had disappeared, Jinwoo searched for another one near the location and activated Shadow Exchange. But to think that Shadow Soldier just so happened to be the one in Lennart Nierman's shadow. Thanks to that, he got to save the lives of these two men. Jinwoo hurriedly checked Thomas Andre's wounds and breathed a sigh of relief. The American's wounds looked pretty serious, but thankfully, he'd be able to survive. Seong Jinwoo Hunter Nim, thank you for stopping the beastard. My apologies, but can you evacuate Thomas to somewhere safe? Jinwoo politely asked in English, and Lennart nodded his head energetically. Compared to fighting that monstrosity, this job sounded so much easier. Yes, you don't have to worry about that one. The German cautiously lifted Thomas up and hurriedly distanced himself. Meanwhile, Jinwoo shifted his gaze over to the beast, raising its body up. Tangible, horrifying, murderous intent oozed from the creature. He sensed power on another realm compared to other monsters from the beastard. I knew it. His guess was on the money. This thing possessed a similar sort of aura to the ice elf he met earlier. It was, indeed, one of the sovereigns that were hunting down the hunters. The thin, fog-like smoke suddenly coagulated into a singular mass before morphing into a humanoid shape. Isn't that? It was the ancient ice elf, the sovereign of frost, hiding its presence as a fog until now, had finally revealed itself. Jinwoo realized that the fog wrapped around the city was not a natural phenomenon the moment he came in contact with it. And this time, it was from his behind. A weird female voice harsh enough to grate his ears came from behind him, and Jinwoo quickly looked back. And that's where he discovered a spectacle that made him doubt his own eyes. A horde of insects poured out from the sewerage and began merging into one to assume the shape of a humanoid female. Jinwoo's expression hardened, now that he found himself suddenly surrounded by his enemies. And then, he realized it. They gagged his shadow soldiers by confusing the signals, not because they were worried about their hunt being disrupted by him. No, they did that in order to hide the fact that there were more than one of them here. In other words, this was a trap. A trap laid out in the entirety of Seoul in order to box Jinwoo in. Enemies possessing power on another scale altogether, and 3 of them to boot. 2. His black heart, sleeping quietly until now, began to pound away madly at the entrance of these 3 incredibly powerful foes. Good. The corners of Jinwoo's lips arched up. These things were thinking that they had managed to surround him. But the thing was, he wasn't alone. In reality, they were the ones surrounded now. Jinwoo kept his senses ultra-sharp in order to not miss their movements and summoned out his army that'd surround his enemies. Come out. New York, London, Shanghai, Paris. Besides these cities, others around the world were all experiencing the phenomenon of their streets being draped in eerie silence right now. People had stopped walking and found themselves unable to tear their eyes away from the many electronic screens installed here and there. Those large screens were continuously showing the breaking news regarding the horrifying tragedy unfolding in the capital city of South Korea, Seoul. Because of the supermassive gate's presence, the world's attention had been focused there already, so it was only normal that the news spread around like a wildfire. Seoul was one of the biggest metropolises in the entire world. But with such a city lying in ruins like that, it implied that their safety couldn't be guaranteed even within their own cities. The tragedy of Seoul didn't feel like an incident happening in some distant country, but something that was happening to them personally. Was that the reason why they felt relieved when Thomas Andre stepped up to put an end to the monster's rampage? The viewers gathered their hands in prayer and with one heart cheered Goliath on. And that was why the streets were filled with elated cries every time Goliath roughed up that beast-like monster. Yes, more, destroy that thing. Unfortunately, the cheering and elated cries filling up the streets soon morphed into shocked silence as Goliath's fists were shattered. His arms were broken, and his blood and flesh were spilt onto the ground. Some even began wordlessly shedding tears as they watched humanity's best warrior being horribly destroyed like that. It was as if the time itself had frozen. People rendered utterly speechless by the overwhelming shock couldn't even hear their own breathing. It was then, a lone hunter jumped out from somewhere and blew away the beast. No, there were 2 of them. A black-haired man appeared without warning right next to the Caucasian hunter. The anchors saw the black soldiers filling up the streets in the blink of an eye and cried out until their voices turned hoarse. The viewers all around the world punched the air and cried out in elation once more as they watched the black soldiers completely cover up the streets of Seoul. especially the Americans. Their unified roars were so loud that their cities seemed to rock from the noise itself. Looking unconcerned in the slightest, the Sovereign of Frost took a step forward. It sucked its breath in lightly before spitting out horrifyingly cold air that spread out everywhere in an instant. And in just one moment, everything standing on the ground became frozen ice sculptures. Even the Shadow Army was no exception. How can this be? Jinwoo confirmed that his soldiers had all frozen up and his expression hardened gradually. The power of the sovereigns that rendered the soldiers useless in one stroke. He had experienced something like this before, when he was facing off against the Sovereign of White Flames, Baron, back in the Demon's Castle Instant Dungeon. If there was one glaring difference between then and now, that would be him having to face 3 enemies instead of 1. The soldiers trapped within the ice couldn't be freed even with his ability to store them back in his shadow. The Sovereign of Frost sounded confident of its victory after imprisoning the Shadow Army. However, Jinwoo's killing intent didn't waver for a second even under the current situation. The tip of the Kamish's wrath held in his right hand was pointed at the Sovereign of Frost. "You will definitely die today." The war potential of the Shadow Army always had been supplementary to his own. It was too bad that he couldn't rely on his soldiers now, but even then, he wasn't thinking of letting that Sovereign of Frost leave here alive. After all, he had a score to settle with that beastard. Perhaps the Ice Elf felt the aching from the wound on its shoulder inflicted by Jinwoo the last time, since its expression crumpled unsightly rather quickly. The creature then raised its arms as if to lift something up, and suddenly, golems made out of ice rose up from the ground. At the same time, the Queen of the Insects whistled loudly. The corpses of humans lying strewn about all began standing up as well. Undead? No, those weren't undead at all. What moved the corpses were strange little parasites that had bored into the brains of the dead humans. Jinwoo sensed the minute level of magic energy emitted from the parasites wiggling around inside the heads, and he shifted his gaze over to the Queen of Insects. The queen had inseminated the eggs of a very special parasite within the corpses of all the humans the beast had murdered. Golems and parasites. Jinwoo stared at the enemy's army that couldn't be turned into shadow soldiers upon their deaths, and realized how much his opponents had been planning for this day. As the time slowed down, the pair of Kamish's wraths roared out in sheer anguish. In an instant, every spider human leaping in the air was bisected. Jinwoo lightly kicked and leapt away from the punch of a golem pounding down on his original position and searched for his primary elimination target. That would be the Sovereign of Frost, of course. That beastard was currently shouting at its golems with an enraged face. However, it was impossible for these slow and lumbering things to catch up to Jinwoo's speed. He used ruler's authority to fling himself at the Sovereign of Frost. Like a bullet, he flew forward in a scarcely believable velocity. He closed the distance in an instant. The Sovereign of Frost was panicking. Jinwoo swung his short sword with great power. His aim was the skin on the beastard's face that resembled the bark of an aged tree. Unfortunately, just before the Kamish's wrath could split the creature's face in half, something really hard blocked the trajectory of the blade. The beast, the Sovereign of Beastly Fangs, responded to Jinwoo's attack with lightning-quick reflexes and blocked the short sword in time. The beast toothily grinned, its disgusting teeth full of blood and flesh now on full display. However, Jinwoo also replied with a smirk. The humans laughing. Even before the beast had the time to sense the ominous foreboding, Kamish's wrath was suddenly enveloped in the black aura. Slice. The beast's wrist that rightfully boasted incredible hardness was cleanly severed from its arm. It was then Jinwoo picked up on some powerful energy above him and he quickly looked up. The Queen of Insects had formed a giant fist out of magical energy and was in the midst of slamming it down. As he landed on the ground, Jinwoo activated the skill ruler's authority to shove away the queen's fist. However, the force behind that attack was much greater than he anticipated and he could only barely stop it. The Queen of Insects swatted Jinwoo as if it was a human swatting a fly out of the air, and slammed him into a building nearby. The impact force from that was so severe that another building across the road shook hard from the vibration. Jinwoo emerged out from the debris of the fallen building and keeled over to the floor to spit out a heavy gasp. He felt dizzy. Loud buzzing tinnitus assaulted his ears. His breathing quickened and his vision grew just a bit fuzzy. However, he had no time to stay here and catch his breath. As soon as he raised his head, he spotted thousands of ice arrows floating up dozens of meters in the air above his head, all of them being the handiwork of the Sovereign of Frost. Jinwoo stood back up and stopped breathing for a moment there, and almost right away, the ice arrows filling up the sky shot down accurately to his current position. Faster, faster. Jinwoo swung his short swords and deflected away the magic arrows raining down without any break or gap in between. He was so fast that several afterimages began overlapping on top of one another. However, just how long will you be able to withstand our combined attacks? The Sovereign of Frost continued to fire the arrows endlessly as a sly grin floated up on its lips. When this human beastard's movement slows down even for a second, it was then. Stab. The ice elf's quaking eyes looked down to confirm the short sword stabbing deeply into its chest. The liquid staining its hands was its own blood. When it raised its head to look, the insolent human was glaring right back at the Sovereign, having had enough leeway to throw one of his short swords even in the midst of deflecting all the ice arrows. I told you, didn't I? You won't be getting out of here alive. The Sovereign of Frost, thoroughly enraged while controlling its ice golems, the spider humans controlled by the Sovereign of Plagues, and finally, the Sovereign of Beastly Fangs that had regenerated its severed wrist. The latter moved its new wrist this way and that to test it out, before summoning out its own sword from the subspace. Just like Jinwoo had done, all of their movements were caught in one go within Jinwoo's vision. He grasped both Kamish's wraths tightly and calmly collected his breaths as his enemies rushed at him again. Accompanied by the noise of something solid splitting up, he was greeted from behind by a voice that sounded so much more brilliant to his ears today. My king, Baru. Even before he felt happy at his master looking back at him, all those little nicks and scrapes on Jinwoo's body entered Baru's vision first. They were caused by the insect woman when she smacked his liege into the building just now. A mere insect woman dared to lay her hands on his king. She dared to touch his king. Baru's anger reached a new height and he flew directly at the queen of the insects. The thunderous screech of Baru reverberating throughout the battlefield that used to be city streets rendered the Sovereign of Frost quite surprised. Such a thing shouldn't even happen. It took a closer look at Baru's power in the emergency mode for a second there, and spat out a gasp of shock next. This power didn't belong to some measly shadow soldier at all. Each and every single one of the soldiers with martial grade acting as the Shadow Sovereign's hands and feet could be considered as destruction personified. The Sovereign of Frost couldn't have imagined that it would see a martial grade creature today and failed to hide its astonishment. In the meantime, Baru had arrived right before the Queen of Insects, the target for his unquenchable rage. Shut up, you crazy wench. At the back, the Sovereign of Frost. From the front, the Sovereign of Beastly Fangs. Scary attacks from the two monsters possessing powers on another level rained down on him. Lennart Nierman was sure of it now. He was sure that there was no one else around here that could chase after the battle of those three with their bare eyes except himself. As long as the grievously wounded Thomas Andre remained lying on the ground while being treated by the healers surrounding him. Even then, he couldn't clearly chase after Jinwoo's movements with his eyes. Only sighs of admiration kept leaking out of his mouth. Hunter Seong Jinwoo was not being pushed back by an inch even though he was fighting against the beast that subdued the Special Authority rank tanker with brute strength, as well as a monster that froze up the vast ground with a single breath. And soon, Hunter Seong's shape simply melted into thin air, and only the series of unending metallic clangs reverberated around the battlefield. Thomas Andre couldn't win against his curiosity, roused up from all those suspicious explosive noises, and had to ask, "What is going on?" Lennart murmured with disbelieving voice, unable to tear his gaze away from Jinwoo. "It's as if I'm looking at the end of the world." Lennart spat out his genuine thoughts stewing in his head, not even bothering to dress it up in fancy words, and shook his head. Jinwoo heard Baru's scream and his head snapped in that direction. The former Ant King was being trampled under the Queen of Insects' foot and was putting up a desperate struggle to escape, but it was proving to be inadequate. At that moment, Jinwoo's eyes widened. Magical energy was leaving Baru's body and his existence was gradually thinning out. Could that be how the soldier attached to Thomas's shadow was erased, too? Jinwoo's expression hardened. He couldn't afford to lose Baru like this. That guy was one of his most precious soldiers and at the same time, the greatest fighting power within the Shadow Army. If Baru disappears and stops distracting the Queen of Insects, then this precarious balance will break down. This problem was also linked to his current battle as well. Jinwoo once more shook off the ice spear and the blade heading his way, and dashed towards the Queen of Insects. Since the Queen was far too focused on destroying the most powerful Shadow Soldier, it discovered Jinwoo's approach a little too late. Carrying a horrendous amount of magic energy, slammed into the insects wrapped around the Queen and blew them away. After its true visage was revealed once more, the Queen failed to disguise its fluster. It hurriedly spat out a green-colored liquid onto Jinwoo's face, but he simply activated Ruler's authority to deflect it away. As for the obvious poison remaining in the air, his passive buff easily neutralized it. The powers of the Sovereign of Plagues couldn't threaten Jinwoo in the slightest, and she was already within his attack radius. In that brief moment, a cold gleam flickered within his eyes. Just now, the Sovereign of Frost didn't die when its heart was pierced. There was a good chance it'd be the same story for this Sovereign of Plagues, too. In that case, since he had no idea where this creature's weakness was, he might as well continue to attack until he found it. Jinwoo got even closer until he was within touching distance to the Queen of Insects and gripped his short swords real tight. Violent slash. The blades rained down like buckshots on the Queen of Insects and turned the creature's entire body into a torn rag in an instant. However, the maggots wiggled and tangled with each other inside the monster's body to quickly restore its body. Regeneration. It wasn't a problem, though. If it possessed an ability to regenerate its body, then all he had to do was continuously pour out attacks that surpassed the rate of regeneration. That was all. Jinwoo chased after the Queen of Insects being knocked back and activated the skill, Violent Slash, over and over again. Bekamish's wraths, carrying the jet black aura, fired out without a single break like a gun with infinite ammo. He activated Violent Slash with all his might, repeatedly, until he completely disintegrated every little bit of flesh that the Queen of Insects could potentially regenerate. And eventually, the ecstasy of level-up messages filling up his vision still felt great. Nice. However, when recalling the fact that he still had 2 more enemies aiming for his neck, he couldn't lounge around feeling happy for himself. Jinwoo urgently tried to turn around towards the direction of the intense murderous intent in order to defend himself. But his enemy was just a little bit quicker. While he was preoccupied with killing the Sovereign of Plagues, someone rushed towards him and extended its long hand. 5 separate strands of sharp wind blew in from behind his back. Jinwoo discovered 5 claws plunging past his chest. The beastly Sovereign had completely transformed itself into a werewolf and accurately stabbed Jinwoo's back with 5 blade-like claws on its right hand. All 5 had penetrated through his vital point. Jinwoo's body froze up at that moment. The pair of Kamish's wraths fell from Jinwoo's hands. The Sovereign of Frost stood before him. Icy cold air spun and coagulated in the Ice Elf's hand and created an ice dagger. The ice dagger stabbed Jinwoo in his belly. Completely assured of its victory now, the ancient Ice Elf began moving that tree bark-like skin to form a contorted grin. The beastard leaned in closer to whisper in Jinwoo's ear. The Sovereign of Frost distanced itself from Jinwoo's ear and stared at his hardened expression before forming an insidious grin. The icy coldness spread out from the dagger stabbing into his belly and froze up Jinwoo's body. As the icicle reached up to his face, his eyes continued to emit flames of sheer anger. Even then, the Sovereign of Frost was smirking derisively. The Ice Elf yanked the dagger out and immediately stabbed it into Jinwoo's heart. The icy blade oozing whitish light easily shattered his rib bones and accurately penetrated his heart. The Sovereign of Frost confirmed that the human's heart had been destroyed and pulled the dagger out. Jinwoo powerlessly collapsed to the ground. His head clattered on the hard surface and he felt this crippling vertigo. At the same time, he